Good morning, everyone. My name is Sune Rock Steffensen, and I'm Senior Fellow at the Danish Institute of Advanced Study. That was introduction number one. Introduction number two is for this new lecture series that's on Mind in the Anthropocene. And I'm just going to say that this is going to be a lecture series because Ed is going to say a few more words about that. Which brings me to introduction number three, which is of today's speaker, Edward Bax, who joined SDU and Danish Institute of Advanced Study in September, and we're very happy to have you here. So Ed is an ecological psychologist, has a background from University of Edinburgh, where he did his PhD, and he's been moving since then to some of the leading research centers on ecological psychology. And if you ask yourself, what is that? Perhaps Ed will give you some kind of an answer today. I hope so.
Maybe not.
Or maybe not. There's like two options here. So Ed has been working at, he got a fellowship at the University College London, been working at University of Cincinnati, and most recently at the University of Western Ontario at the Rodman Institute of Philosophy there. As I said, Ed is an ecological psychologist working on such issues as social coordination, language and interaction, and also architecture. So some of the projects that Ed has been working on is acting in a populated environment, and ecological realist inquiry, whatever, interspeaking and collaborating, and most recently on perception action-based design for improving urban accessibility. So this kind of the architectural and the coordinative and the communicative comes together in Edward's work, which makes you like a perfect fit for the DS. So happy to have you here, and the floor is yours, and you can say a few more words about the lecture series.
Okay, thanks, Sina. So I'm going to be talking today, this sort of introductory talk in a lecture series that we put together. So I'm going to be talking on the human sciences in the Anthropocene. This is the poster for the talk series, which Rick has been in charge of putting together, and that's quite pretty, I think. So we have a series of lectures coming up on the concept of the Anthropocene and what that means for how we think about the mind. So we have a series of speakers coming. Mark Maslin will be giving an online talk next month. He's an earth system scientist. Then we have Ted Toadvine, a philosopher, and later in the year some cognitive scientists. This is the lineup that we have so far. We're looking forward to those talks. So my talk today, this is the outline of what I'll be talking about. So first of all, I'll very briefly explain what the Anthropocene is, and then I'll go into a sort of a broad problem that arises with this concept of the Anthropocene, and then I'll get into three specific areas where it seems like there might be some sort of consequence that follows from adopting the Anthropocene, for consequences for the human sciences. So first of all, this is the thesis of the talk today in one slide, in one sentence. So what I'll be arguing today is basically this, that the human sciences in the 21st century should be, or perhaps are going to have to be, centered not on the rational individual actor, which has been the case in the human sciences, at least in the 20th century. The central unit of analysis has been the individual rational actor. My argument today is that that's no longer adequate for the challenges that we face, and we're going to have to center our human sciences in the future on what I've called here processes of community-driven consensus making, which is a little vague as a phrase, but hopefully it will become a little more clear as we go along. So now let's get into what the Anthropocene is. Some of you in this room have seen this dog before. The Anthropocene, first of all, is a proposed geological epoch. The proposal is that we've moved into a new epoch of geological time marked by the influence of human activity. So that's the concept of the Anthropocene. But I find it useful to use this dog as an illustration of the concept. So this dog is an anthropogenic object. Of course, it has clothes on and a hat, so there's been some human intervention here, clearly. But also, it's a domestic dog, and domestic dogs would not exist if it wasn't for human intervention in pre-existing nature. If it wasn't for the fact that our ancestors had interacted with and domesticated the ancestors of this particular dog. So the way I think of the Anthropocene is a sort of generalization of this idea. We know that we've domesticated dogs. We've been familiar with this for a long time. The idea of the Anthropocene is that this applies not just to domesticated animals. Human influence applies to all of life, and including our own lives. So that's how I like to think of what the Anthropocene means. There's ongoing discussion, I should point out, in the geological community about whether the Anthropocene is sort of a clearly enough defined concept that we can actually use it to separate out the geological record. So what geologists are looking for is a specific point in the rock strata where you can identify a change that's happened in life processes. So you want to be able to identify multiple sites around the world where you can say, here the rocks they look this way, and above this the rocks look a different way. Here we have something else going on, a different process. The ongoing discussions have to do with whether a geological epoch is the right way to separate human activity from pre-human activity, whether we can identify a specific start date is a big sticking point. So I'm not going to come down on any particular side on where the Anthropocene starts. What I want to point out is just that there seems to be a general agreement that we are now, in the Anthropocene, we've entered a period of Earth's history where human activity is sort of the decisive factor, and it has changed life on planet Earth in a very general way. So one of the sort of popular proposed start dates for the Anthropocene is after the Second World War. So there's this period called the Great Acceleration, and you can see it in these charts here. So these charts on this slide show increase of human activity, human behavior, since the end of the Second World War. So in particular, at the top here, we have an increase in population, which exploded after around 1950. We also have an increase in use of water, a massive increase in fertilizer consumption. There are way more McDonald's restaurants now than there were 100 years ago. So that's human behavior. And that maps very clearly onto these more ecosystems measurements. So at the top we have carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. We all know about these. There are also measures of ozone depletion, temperature. There are oceans measurements, so overfishing of the oceans, and some terrestrial measurements of overuse of forest resources. So it seems like these two things taken together, the increase of human behavior and all of these ecosystems impact measurements, tell us that we've really started to affect the ecosystem in quite a profound way. Right. So that's the Anthropocene. And the first consequence, so this is a very broad consequence of the Anthropocene for the human sciences. So it seems like if we accept that we've moved into the Anthropocene, we can no longer maintain this distinction that we've had, this dichotomy that we've had between nature and humanity. So this dichotomy was made quite explicitly by one of the founders of cognitive science, Herb Simon. So he was working in the 1950s and 60s on these ideas. He was a very interdisciplinary figure, so he also won a Nobel Prize in economics, as well as being a founding figure in cognitive science. So one thing that Herb Simon suggested in the 1960s initially was that we should divide the sciences into two. So he's sort of starting with the question, so why do we do science at all? And his answer is that, well, why do we have science? We have science because the world is just really complex, and we can't just look at it and understand what's going on. We have to have laws. We have to figure out laws that describe what's going on. So we have natural sciences that do that for natural processes, things like physics and chemistry. But what Herbert Simon was suggesting in the 1960s was that we also have a different kind of science, the sciences of the artificial. And these are the sciences that study things that we ourselves have created. So things like economies, or organizations, or languages. So things that we've created, but that nevertheless are so complex that we need a science to understand how they work. So he made this distinction between the natural sciences that studies the world, the existing world, and the sciences of the artificial that studies human-made artifacts. And interestingly, he included within the sciences of the artificial cognitive science, or the science of the human mind. So the human mind itself, for Herbert Simon, is a human artifact. It's something that we've created. So this is from a paper that he wrote in 1980, describing cognitive science as one of these sciences of the artificial. And he says that we can think of adaptive systems, such as the human mind, as artificial systems. And what he means by that is that they are systems that, when the environment changes, the system changes so as to fit the environment, as if it's been deliberately designed to fit that environment. So what we have here is a kind of implied causal relation, a direction of causation. So it seems like Herbert Simon is here suggesting that, well, the environment changes, and then we come along, we human problem solvers, we come along and adapt to the problem. We figure out a solution. So that's one possible directional mapping between nature and humanity. So other people have been problematizing this for a long time. So this essay from Bruno Latour in 1990 is a famous example. So he wrote this essay called "We Have Never Been Modern." And what he meant by that, what he meant by modernity was, when we say that we're modern, when we say that we are a modern species, we're implicitly contrasting ourselves with a sort of pre-modern state. We're contrasting ourselves with pre-modern humanity that existed presumably in a state of nature. And in this essay in 1990, Latour is arguing that that's really never been the case. We've never been separate from nature. So he points to these hybrid phenomena. So the hole in the ozone layer that people were very worried about in the 1980s as a result of aerosols, or the AIDS virus, a zoonotic virus. So in this essay from 1990, Latour ends up arguing, and he has diagrams explicitly showing this relation. He argues that our sciences really deal with a sort of interplay between nature on the one side and society on the other. And this is what he means by rejecting the idea of modernity. We've never had a humanity that's separate from nature. So the moral that he wants to convey is that we're kind of fools for allowing ourselves to think that we're separate from nature. But notice that Latour here is still using the word nature. So he's still contrasting society and nature, even while he's drawing that contrast into question. So I think one of maybe the most profound message of the Anthropocene is that it breaks down this nature-humanity dichotomy so much that it kind of draws into question the terms that we're using to begin with. There are scientists now who call themselves Earth system scientists, rather than natural scientists. And what Earth system scientists are arguing is that we've so much affected the functioning of the Earth as a system that we can't really go back. We can't really go back to a sort of pre-existing state where now we've now fundamentally changed the way it operates. We've disrupted it that much. So the suggestion here is that maybe a more accurate causal diagram is not to contrast nature and society, but to say that, well, we have this Earth system, and we've come along, humans, we've come along and disturbed the operation of the Earth system. So that's the reframing that the Anthropocene provides us. And so, by the way, this is the image from the title slide is an arable farm from in the Arabian desert. So this is made possible by artificial irrigation. There's a crops photograph from space. Okay, so we'll now look in a little bit more detail at three specific consequences that I think follow from accepting the Anthropocene and that follow for the human sciences. So first of all, I'd like to problematize the concept of rationality. So this I've taken from a book by the cognitive scientist Steven Pinker. So Steven Pinker in the last 10 years or so has been defending the Enlightenment, defending the sort of Enlightenment 18th century ideals of reason and humanity, humanism and progress. So this is a book that he wrote fairly recently, so in 2018 this came out. And this quote here that I have comes from before chapter 1 in the book. So he starts the book by telling us this anecdote about a question that he was asked after a public lecture that he gave. So he gave a public lecture on Steven Pinker's ideas about the mind. According to Pinker, the mind is sort of a computational mechanical device. And so he gave this lecture, and then a student at the end of the lecture stood up and asked this question. So why should I live? So the question, I think, is, given this mechanistic understanding of the mind, and the idea that we live in a deterministic universe, where is the purpose in life? So Steven Pinker then writes his answer. This isn't his verbatim answer. This isn't a transcript from the talk. This is his reconstruction of what he thinks he said. So it's his sort of perfect, he presents it as this sort of perfect answer to the question. And what I want you to notice here is the individualistic framing of Steven Pinker's answer. So the question itself is already individualistic in the way that it's framed. So why should I live? Not why should everyone live, but why should I live? But Steven Pinker then runs with that. So he says, well, so you, by the very fact of asking that question, you, the person in the audience, are seeking reasons for your convictions, and so you are committed to reason as the means to discover and justify what is important to you. And there are so many reasons to live. And then he starts listing reasons to live. And all of these are reasons for you. So what do you get out of living? So as a sentient being, you have the potential to flourish. You can engage in learning and debate. You can appreciate the beauty and richness of the natural world. So all of these things that he's listing are things that are sort of personal pleasures. It's as if Steven Pinker has taken the question, why should I live? And he's interpreted it as life, what's in it for me? And so this is just the first part of the response to this student. We'll get to the second part a little later. But let's focus on this sort of what's in it for me framing. So Steven Pinker thinks the Enlightenment ideas are worth defending because they give us this sort of what's in it for me framing about reason and science and so forth. But there's a problem with this framing. There's a problem if we want to use this what's in it for me logic and use it to respond to the major challenge of our time, climate change. And this problem was pointed out quite nicely by another psychologist in 2009, Dan Ariely. So he said this. He said, if you wanted to create a problem that people don't care about, you'd probably come up with something like global warming. And then he gives 4 reasons to justify this statement. So why is it that people don't really fundamentally feel like they care about global warming? So these are his 4 reasons. And I think the first 3 are actually maybe not as compelling as they were in 2009. So the first 3 are that, well, the effects of global warming, they're distant, they're in the future. So it's hard to care about them now. I think maybe that's not really true anymore. Many of us would say climate change is no longer in the future, it's actually happening. But this is 2009. The second thing he says, that the things that are happening now, it's difficult to see them. Again, I'm not sure that holds up anymore. And then he also says that it's difficult to put a face on the problem. So the victims of climate change are sort of this anonymous mass of humans. They're somewhere in the future, somewhere else. It's hard to put a face on the problem. And again, I'm not sure that that holds up anymore. But the last reason that he gives is sort of the most interesting, I think. So he says that it feels like when we respond to the challenge of climate change as individuals, it feels like our behavior just has a negligible effect. So maybe you do your recycling, or you choose to go on fewer flights than you used to. It feels like, well, I'm not really getting anything out of this. It's costing me something, but the benefit is negligible. It's a drop in the bucket. So that feels like, it's kind of a compelling argument still. It feels quite compelling. So what I want to argue is that it only feels compelling because of the framing, because of the individualistic framing. So here's a different framing. Here's a more collective framing. So this is an attempt at a more collective framing of the climate change rule. So this is from a paper published in Nature in 2009, which sets out a safe operating space for humanity. So the diagram here, it's a little noisy, but the green circle in the middle is what they're saying is the safe operating space for humanity. We have a budget of carbon. We have a budget of how much we can acidify the oceans, how much we can overfish the oceans, and so forth. And if we stay in that green circle for all of these measurements, then we're fine. But as you see, we're already overshooting on various measurements. So it's maybe a bit difficult to read, but biodiversity loss and nitrogen in the atmosphere are the ones that point out. So already with this diagram, we're looking at a collective representation of the problem. So we've shifted the problem from asking what's in it for me to asking, well, here's a global problem, how do we fix it? But quite soon after this was published, people pointed out, well, there's a problem with this framing, is that, well, we're already overshooting in all these ways, and yet we still have people living in poverty, lots of people living in poverty, so we're not meeting people's basic needs. And already we've got this great overshoot. So this is from an economist, Kate Raworth. She proposes, this is sort of a critique of the previous diagram. So she keeps she proposes this model, the donut model. So she keeps the safe operating space. So the outside of this donut here is those overshoots of use of our resources. But then she also has an inner shortfall. So the problems on the inside here are the shortfall where we're not providing for people's basic needs. So she's just taken the previous diagram, and the inside is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So she's pointing out that, well, we need to give people enough energy and give people enough water and food and education while not overshooting. So what this model represents, what it presents to us in one diagram, is these sort of 2 problems that exist at the same time. We're trying to avoid the overshoot and avoid the shortfall where we're not providing for people's basic needs. And that's her representation from 2017 of how well we were doing. It turns out we were not doing particularly well in either the overshoot or the shortfall. But the important point here is that this gives us a different way of thinking about the overall problem. So it takes us from the individualistic, what's in it for me framing, and gives us this sort of double optimization problem. So we have to live within our limits and also provide enough for everybody. So as a lesson for this first section on rationality, I'd like to propose this. So we can say that rational decision making in the Anthropocene should be first and foremost about respecting our collective boundaries, and only secondly should it be about maximizing our individual utility, maximizing our individual pleasure, which was what Pinker was putting front and center. So that's a reframing of rationality. Now, already we've moved there towards a collective representation of our climate change problem. So the next step was how do we address that? How do we engage in collective behaviour in order to respond to the challenges that are presented by that diagram? So here we can turn back to Steven Pinker. So this is the second half of his reconstructed answer to that student. And the way he frames, so here he's turning towards the problem of cooperation, and he eventually is defending human progress as a result of Enlightenment thinking. But the way he presents collective pro-social behaviour is that it's something, again, that we kind of do for our own benefit. So why should you engage in behaviour that benefits others? Well, you've been endowed with this sense of sympathy. You have the ability to like and respect other people, and therefore you enjoy the gift of mutual benevolence with friends. So you get something out of helping other people. And because reason tells you that none of this is particular to you, you have the responsibility to provide to others what you expect for yourself. So that's Pinker sort of paraphrasing Kant's categorical imperative. And then he ends by sort of defending progress as something that results from everyone looking out for their own self-interest. So this is how Pinker chooses to introduce his 600-page book on the Enlightenment. And notice, by the way, that Bill Gates says this is my new favourite book of all time. I think it was worth noting. So we should help other people out of a sense of sympathy that we get, a sense of pleasure that we get from helping other people. Well, it feels like that's maybe just inadequate to address the kind of donut problem that we just saw. One argument for why this individual self-fulfillment argument might be inadequate is this very famous essay from the 1960s, The Tragedy of the Commons. So this is kind of a strange essay. It's a bit eugenicsy if you actually read the essay. But it's a very famous theoretical argument against the individualistic framing of these common pool resource management problems. So the central sort of parable in this essay is that you have a common pasture, a grassland, and there's a village, and all of the individual villagers just take their cows, their cattle to the pasture, and the cows eat the grass, and the benefit of that accrues to the person who owns the cow. So it's always in somebody's individual interest, or in everyone's individual interest, to put one more cow on the common pasture, which everyone's following the same logic. Everyone puts one more cow, and eventually there is no more grass because there's too many cows and they've eaten all the grass. So you end up with the tragedy of the commons. So through this selfish behaviour, you end up with a situation where, as Garrett Hardin, the author, says, freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. So that's a theoretical argument against individualism as the driver of a solution to common problems. Well, fortunately, it seems like this is a problem. Fortunately, people have studied what actually happens when you look at these collective action problems, these so-called tragedy of the commons problems. So one person who looked at this is another Nobel laureate in the economic sciences, Elinor Ostrom. So her work was on looking at how people actually solve these problems of governing common pool resources. So this is one of the examples she points to. It's an example of a fishing community in Turkey in the 1970s, where the fishing community was overfishing the local stocks. So they had a problem. They had to solve it. And the way that they solved it is they formed a cooperative. They had very explicit rules that they all agreed to. They came up with the rules together. And the rules were that you can only, you have to sign up for the roster, and you can only fish at a particular site on a given day that you've been assigned to. And so the fish that they're fishing, they have this migratory behavior. So they're migrating from east to west at one part of the year, and from west to east at another part of the year. So the way that they set it up, the fishing cooperative, is that they had people in individual boats sort of lined up. So they would be, your boat is here today, tomorrow you'll be here, the next day you'll be here, and everyone's sort of moving one along the line. And they're going in the opposite direction to the fish. So everyone gets a fair chance of getting the fish. And one of the advantages of this is that it's sort of self-policing. So if your boat has been assigned to the spot today where all the fish are, then your boat is probably going to be there. So if another boat comes along and they try to muscle in and they're not assigned to be there, then you can report them to the community and say, well, look, you're not respecting the rules. This system only works if we all uphold the rules together. And then you have a process of dispute resolution. So it works because you have explicit rules and everyone's it's simple enough that everyone understands how the system works. So that's one example. And then what Elinor Ostrom did is she extracted from examples like this a series of 8 rules for how to effectively govern common pooled resources. So I won't go through all of them. The point is that things have to be clear, they have to be democratic, there has to be buy-in from the community that's affected by the rules. I just want to highlight 3 of them. So number 3. So the first thing is that you should ensure that the rules, the people affected by the rules, participate in modifying the rules. So you should have a say in making the rules that you're going to be governed by. And I think it's maybe interesting. It's an interesting exercise here to think, well, do we have this situation now for climate emissions? Do we have a say do we in this room have a say in the decisions about whether we explore unexplored oil resources, or whether where we're buying our oil from, where the gas station down the road is buying their oil from? That's an exercise for the room that we can go back to. So that's one. Next one, so number 5. In order to effectively govern commons, you should develop a system which is carried out by the members of the community, and that involves monitoring members' behaviour. So that's the example there is the self-policing that happens in the fishing community example that I just gave you. And then the last one here is also worth pointing out, I think. So these systems work if you build responsibility for governing the common resource in nested tiers from the lowest level up to the entire system. And again, so what Elinor Ostrom is suggesting here is that these systems work. These systems of rule-based governance work if people are bought into them from the bottom up. So again, I think it's interesting to think whether that exists in our current response to climate change and carbon emissions. So the lesson from this second part on cooperative behaviour is this. So the way that we should think about behaviour change in the Anthropocene in the 21st century is going to require us to think in the kind of ways that Elinor Ostrom is suggesting. So we need to think about how organisations, how systems of rules are built at the community scale. And so now we get to the last consequence of the Anthropocene for the human sciences. I've put here the future of life on Earth, which is maybe a bit broad. It's really the point I want to make here is about aesthetics. And I'll be very brief here. So the way of thinking about aesthetics, about beauty, that we've inherited again from the Enlightenment thinkers, is again a very individualistic way of thinking. So a central concept in Enlightenment aesthetics is this concept of the sublime. And the sublime it kind of denotes a sense of individual awe. For Kant, the sublime it seems to be connected with the infinite, and it's often illustrated by this painting, this Caspar David Friedrich painting of a single individual looking out over an expanse rock over clouds. So what the painter here is trying to capture is this individual sense that you're looking out over something that's so much bigger than yourself, so infinite, that we can't even comprehend it. It baffles our sense of reason because it's bigger than us. And this is sort of wrapped up with the idea that nature is this unspoilt realm that we have to maintain. So that's the Enlightenment way of thinking about aesthetics. But there's a different way of thinking about aesthetics that's been proposed by people like the writer Emma Maris. So she suggests that we should think of nature, including us, but the whole of nature as a kind of garden, a rambunctious garden is the phrase that she uses. So what she says is that, well, there isn't really any such thing as unspoilt nature. There isn't really such a thing as the natural sublime on Earth, because we've affected everything. Our influence is so extensive that we've affected everything on Earth. So instead, we should think of the Earth as a kind of garden. We should think of the parts that we choose to leave sort of as they were. That has to be an active decision. So we have to choose to leave them there as they are, as if it was a garden that we were tending, that we were managing. So I've illustrated this with a beaver on top of a pile of logs, because I think this is quite a nice parallel with the man on the top of the mountain. So what the argument is that if we're going to have the kind of things that we value as natural as nature, it's going to require an active decision on our part to keep those things, to make space for things like beavers. And here's the lesson of this last part. So in the Anthropocene, preserving non-human life is not something that we can take for granted. We're going to have to make an active decision to allocate space to things like nature reserves. We're going to have to make, and therefore we're going to have to make a collective assessment of what it is that we value. So do we want to keep these things? That's something that we're going to have to decide collectively. So that's sort of the end of the talk. So just to reiterate the 3 points, the 3 consequences of accepting the Anthropocene. So first of all, I've argued that we need to rethink what rationality is. We need to move away from this idea that rationality is about maximizing your individual happiness, your individual utility. And we need to move towards a conception of rationality that puts the collective needs first, the donut that we saw, and then the pursuit of individual happiness can only come secondarily, because if we don't look out for the collective interests, there's going to be no collective. There will be no individual utility maximization, no individual seeking of pleasure in the future. The second point on cooperation. So we also need to get rid of this idea that cooperation is something that we have to voluntarily participate in as a kind of charitable choice that we make towards other people. We need to move away from that in favor of a view of sustainable behavior as a kind of systemic design challenge, the kinds of design systems that Elinor Ostrom was looking at. And the last point is about aesthetics. So we need to move away from this idea of nature as an unspoilt realm that will always be there, because it doesn't exist anymore. This is Emma Maris's argument. And we need, therefore, to move to a different conception of the aesthetics of life. We need to move towards a conception of non-human life as a kind of garden that we have to actively maintain. And that's the end of the talk, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed, and very well timed. So that means we have time for questions, and so there's recording being done, so you have to shout out the questions because the acoustics in this room is not very good. I think that Nina was the first.
Thank you for a great talk, Ed. I really appreciated it. I really enjoyed it. This is not my point of view I'm going to put forward, but I would like to ask you sort of from the devil's advocate point of view, but not from the, sorry, I'm going to take this a step further and ask with Donna Haraway. Could you please go back to the last slide? It's still very much and us and them, isn't it? It's humans doing this. It's not, Donna Haraway will take it a step forward and say we're not in the Anthropocene, we're saying, and I can't pronounce it, but in
The Capitalism. Yeah.
You at least, can you say loudly so that people can hear how it's pronounced?
I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but right. So yeah. So her argument is that we should say that we're in the Capitalism.
Yeah, where we are not just the collective in the first one is not just about us as humans. It's about cross-species collectivism, and not collectivism as an uncontentious, as based on a very contentious place, obviously. And so the cooperation is not just between the collective of humans, but between us and other species. We should make kin with other species.
Yeah.
And the aesthetics of life, we are still talking about nature. You did put across that, but you did say nature a lot of times, and not just in the unspoiled realm version. And so she would also push that a bit further, and not just a bit. She would push that a lot further, and saying that we should talk about the cross species. Not just, and we shouldn't talk about non-human life, we should talk about the tentaculars reaching out between all kinds of species. So I just really like to hear your view on taking your position that one large step further.
Yeah, I must admit that I'm not sure I understand the argument about the Cthulhu scene. Like, I've tried to read some of what she's written, and she's a good provocateur, I think. But yeah, I'm not sure. Like, she has other suggestions. So she says, oh well, we're not in the Anthropocene. She goes through the Plantationocene. So she's also making a contrast with slavery. And then she has another one as well, I think. And I'm not really sure what the sort of practical outcome is.
Her main point is that we're still being paternalistic in this, that we are seeing ourselves as the rational agents, but that we should be much more democratic, and we should be much more sensitive and empathetic, and not just empathetic in the paternalistic sense, but in the actual sense of
so perhaps part of the point is that we're kind of being narcissistic by putting ourselves at the centre and saying it's the Anthropocene, it's the human age, and she wants to problematize that, which I think it's certainly a useful impulse. I guess I would say that so the things I've been considering here. So what is rationality? I think few people. I don't know whether Donna Haraway would argue this, but few people would want to say that the worms in the soil are engaging in rational activity, and that therefore we should include them in our discussion of what rationality is. I think so. The human sciences, I still think that there's something useful in Herbert Simon's distinction between the natural sciences and the artificial sciences. So the kinds of questions that I'm discussing here they're still, in a sense, belong within the sciences of the artificial, so they're still about these human-made structures. So one thing that we can do within the human sciences is use these ideas of the Anthropocene and use those to change how we as humans engage with nature or with the Earth system. And maybe this kind of stuff doesn't really apply to worms or mosquitoes or octopuses. So yeah, that's maybe a half response, but that's where I would start.
It signs very well with what I think myself.
Okay.
I was just interested.
We'll get to the other half on another day. Jeppe first.
Yes, I think I have two questions. The first one would be, could you say something more about the political consequences of this change? Because as I hear you, this is of course a critique of individualism, right? And individualism is of course also the basis of, you could say, liberal democracy and the individual ownership of land and capital and so on. So would the Anthropocene be compatible with an economy with individual ownership of land and capital and with liberal democracy? So that would be the first question. And the second one would be, could you also take us back to the question of the human sciences in this age? Because at least history is very much concerned with people. and with names in our research. So should we move away from that, from writing biographies and writing papers with a lot of with a lot of names in them?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's two good questions. So, so the first one. So is I'm going to interpret that as is capitalism compatible with the Anthropocene?
And also democracy. Yeah.
And democracy.
Liberal democracy.
Okay. Well, so I think that that's a question that we have to address. That's the challenge of, that's one of the challenges of the Anthropocene, is, well, this problem, whether we like it or not, we have this problem. And democracy and capitalism, everything is going to be threatened, is already threatened by the system that we have, which is failing, as in many different ways, as we all know.
But what is your view?
I would hope that we can have what Elinor Ostrom imagines, a kind of democratic solution. But I don't think we're on the right path to that solution. I don't think at present we have a situation where we have bottom-up buy-in to a solution. Nobody asks me, and presumably nobody asks you, what do you think we should do to address this problem? It's something that happens somewhere else, you know, in these international meetings that we have no say over. So I think you know that's a collective challenge. How do we respond to this, and will we still have the same democratic system? So I think it's interesting that Steven Pinker has been defending in the last 10 years the Enlightenment, the ideas which I think is, you know, Enlightenment, some good ideas there, obviously. They're the foundation of our political reality. But it's interesting that he feels like he has to defend them. So he has to defend science and progress and basically liberalism. He feels like he has to defend it from what? And presumably he doesn't realize that he's defending, I don't think he thinks he's defending a political position, but he's defending capitalism. Well, maybe he does realize this, but he's defending, and this is why Bill Gates blurbs the book. You know, they're defending the existing system, which works for them. But it's not working for a lot of people. So, yeah, maybe Steven Pinker feels threatened by climate change, and he's threatened by the challenges to the existing political system that we have that are happening as a consequence of that. On the second point about whether we should still do biographies of scientific thinkers, yeah, I think we should. Yeah. I think they're interesting. I don't think everything has to be about the whole planet, but yeah, it's an interesting question.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, I just maybe want to remark that one could maybe paraphrase your summary as saying that we should, as humans, strive to become like a more superior animal, like the ant. Because it seems the ant has achieved some of the check boxes that you are actually describing there, right?
Okay. Haraway would love that answer. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not an expert on ants, but you know, seeing some popular science studies of ants, you know, it looks very much like this, right?
I like the suggestion. Yeah, I might steal that for a future talk. Look to the ants. Yeah.
Yes. But then I also wanted to ask you that it's very much paraphrased as a sort of on or off, like a digital parameter here. Either you're totally rational and you somehow just don't try to push as many cows in the commons as you possibly can, or you totally sweep to the other side. And as far as I can tell, for human nature, everybody has this sort of full spectrum, and they apply various things. And I mean, there are these studies that show that, you know, humans would actually somehow totally disfavor their own gain if it receives the group's approval, right? And so it seems that there's a total mix of us, or a mindset in there. And you know, I don't know how you model that phenomenon.
Yeah, I think that, well, that maybe is consistent with the idea that we're not really rational. This
But
rational
sometimes
individualism.
we are, right? Sometimes we're very rational.
But there are
sometimes we're not, right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
So thanks for that. So we've got the Anthropocene also. So yeah. Keith. And
Okay. So I have a question. So about your notion of rationalism. It seems very. Is it really dependent on this kind of notion of like people being intrinsically motivated to engage in kind of carbon conscious or collective conscious action rather than extrinsic motivation. And so you set this dichotomy by basically saying this collective action is actually extrinsic motivation, and then rationality is this intrinsic motivation to do these kind of pro-social collective, solving these collective action problems. And then I had a follow-up question about how you talked about making kind of respecting collective boundaries the primary concern, and then making kind of people's like welfare or notions of their individual utility secondary. But I'll let you.
So I'm not sure I understand the distinction between extrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I don't think I used those words.
Because in your framing, you're saying that a lot of people doing these actions to, solve this collective action problem, they're being motivated by their own willingness to do this thing. But when we're like rational actors, a lot of times we're responding to a lot of times extrinsic factors, such as trade-offs or extra costs or taxes. And so when you're saying this, it seems like you're saying, oh, it's the rational actors intrinsically motivated, they're making choices based off of what they desire most, and you're not thinking necessarily about these kind of external factors that are shaping their choice set. So that's what I'm really getting out of when your critique of this rationalism.
Yeah.
So you're kind of like saying, does that make sense?
I'm not sure I quite understand your question. Let me put it this way. So in economics, so you're an economist, right, Keith? So in economics, you have this concept of an externality. Maybe that's what you're referring to, or maybe that's related to what you're referring to. I'm not sure. So in economics, you're looking at the system of transactions. You're looking at individual behaviors. You're modeling rational individuals in economic models, and you have maybe a firm as a rational actor modeled within your economic model. But then you don't have anything in your economic model about pollution, about carbon emissions. So that's an externality because it's external to the model. Which a lot of people have pointed out this is a problem in economic modeling. If you have something that's killing us, which is not in the model, and that's the model that you're using to design the world around us, then there's something wrong with your model, maybe. And the kind of reframings that I've been talking about here, moving away from the pinker individualistic framing to the Earth system framing. I think the Earth system framing is the most important reframing here. It's a reframing of the model that we use to understand reality that doesn't have any externalities because everything is happening within the system. So I think that's hopefully. I think the donut model is compelling. I think it's intrinsically compelling on the individual level, so we can look at it and feel like, oh, this is a different way of thinking about economies than what we've had from these previous economic models. Maybe you disagree with that, but maybe have a chat about that.
Yeah.
So,
I have a second question that's a little bit more. So when you also kind of critique, in your critique, you say that we should make individual utility maximization kind of secondary.
Mm-hmm.
Does that basically open the door to, say, a climate authoritarian, where a small cabal says this is what is in collective action, collective interest, and therefore we are willing to accept extreme immiseration of a small subset of the population, or even a large subset of the population, and in order to advance these kind of collective or world-based goals?
I think that's an important question, but I think we already have that. That's a problem that we already have, whether we choose to address it or not. So we already have a problem where if we continue on the course that we're on, there's going to be mass immiseration. There's going to be lots of people who suffer and don't have any say in what happens. This is, the Greta Thunberg argument that she's made over and over again. So yeah, the generation of young people today are well aware of this problem, and that's what they're trying to address.
Two things, and I very much agree with Jørn. I think it's a great point made that sometimes human beings do things just for the sake of, actually not just for the sake of being nice to others. I want to refer to a book of Troy called The Generous Man, and it's really worth reading if you haven't read it, but it has the subtitle, How Helping Others is the Sexiest Thing You Can Do. And it's really about how you actually may gain in the end. You may obtain the biggest success by being nice to others, because that will eventually, like the peacock's tail, it will attract female or the other sex attraction, and you will be, using things not immediately to your own good, which will turn out into your own good again. So we are maybe wired to not just think further than just our immediate own benefit. The second thing, you're so handsome.
Thank you.
The second thing I want to mention is the cure. I'm just thinking here about the cure to how to change or put the collective needs first. And I'm not sure I have found the cure, but I'm reading about a potential cure right now that I want to share with you. And I'm just in the middle of the book, so I'm not sure it's going to work, but I'm really fascinated by a book now called How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. Anybody read it? Okay, it's about using psychedelics, and I'm so fascinated, and I have to try it myself very soon, because it's really a very joint feature of everybody taking psychedelics, that you will feel yourself dissolve into the greater society, and apparently this is a permanent change. Once you have done it, you have kind of reached a new state where you are no longer feeling yourself as an individual, but also very strongly so. So maybe, we all need a shot of mushrooms, and there we go. We will have immediately understood our own place in society and how we are all part of on the same boat.
Maybe so. Put it on the agenda for the next meeting.
Yes, I want to propose. I think we could have some great interdisciplinary discussions.
Can I really like your comments. Maybe I can add a little sort of thing you could maybe try out. So I think that there's been these studies that Scandinavia, I don't know what, always top out on very happy countries, where the populations are expressed and so on. And one of the things that I've sort of seen, because I've had my kids both in school in the US and in Denmark, is that somehow there's a really strong difference in the way that there is an emphasis on behavior and collective sense in the class. That is not really much, it's done on a very different level, I would say, in the US than it's done in Denmark. And somehow, what I hear from industry is that this is super, super good for the most part of the people you want in your industry, because they really love to work together. But you do need a little bit of insertion at the very top of the rest, who are totally individualistic, but they are super smart, so they can direct the rest. But I just wanted to add this little part here, and I don't know if you could do some studies.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, it's true. I think you guys are definitely getting something right in Scandinavia.
And on that note, this is one of the notes that we really like to hear all the time. So, okay, but thank you so much, Ed, for this wonderful talk. Okay, and thank you everybody for coming.